Not yet. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. This is the second part of our series on the Mishkan and the Korbanot. Share my screen. Um, okay. So last week, um, if you recall, we discussed a few different approaches to understanding the Mishkan. We listed five. I don't want to go through everything we said last week, but just as a brief overview of what we said last week, we discussed that perhaps the main purpose of the Mishkan is a place to keep the Luchot. A second approach we mentioned was a place for God to be Shoreh Shekhinah. A third approach we mentioned was a Teguva, it was a Makom Lavodah, a place of worship. A fourth approach, which we mentioned had two approaches within it, was a response to Cheta Egel, whether that's testimony to the fact that God forgave Israel, or whether that's kapara for Cheta Egel. We're going to discuss this approach more in depth tonight, and we're going to really offer a third sub-approach within this approach that is not just kapara for Cheta Egel, but it's a corrective measure that's coming in response to Cheta Egel. And then again, the fifth approach we discussed was Sheneh Shlavim, meaning to say there are really two steps in the process of the legislation of the Korban. We suggested last week that the two Shalavim can be set as such that there was more or less everything we find in Perakim Kafhe through Kaftet. That would be the Mishkan as it was before Heta Egel, minus the Kaporet and the Kiruvim, and also minus the Mizbah HaKetoret, which only comes up in Perek Lamed. If you all recall, last week I argued that one of the reasons why I argued to you last week that the Mizbah HaKetoret really came later was the fact that in the text it's brought later, right? I showed you guys that after the Sikum of the Ma'arechet of Mishkan, after the summary, after the ending really of what would have seemed to be the end of the legislation of the Mishkan, the Mizbah HaKetoret only then is introduced. However, what I didn't address last week is, the obvious question, which I said that there were two things that were introduced: the kaporet and the kiruvim on the one hand, and the mizbah haketoret on the other hand. According to what I just said now, there's an obvious kushia, there's an obvious challenge here, which is that, I'm making the argument that both of these things are introduced at a later stage. However, only one of them are introduced on a literary layer at a later stage. So tonight I want to start our time with discussing why that is, trying to really be metares this kushia, which is once more, if I'm arguing that there's really two stages, and the second stage includes both the kaporet and the kiruvim and the mizbah haketoret, why is only mizbah haketoret on a literary perspective presented later? Okay, if you recall, so you guys can see my screen, yeah? Okay. If you recall, I didn't quote it from the Yerushalmi last week, but it's really the same. It's the same words. I've quoted it from Midrash Rabbah and Shemot, but it's really the same. Yerushalmi in Shekalim, ועשית כפורת זהב טהור, יבוא זהב של כפורת, וכפר על זהב של עגל. Right? That the instruction for the kaporet, that it shall be gold. The symbolism within this instruction is that the gold of the kaporet should come and atone for the sin of the gold of the Heta Egel. Now, what I want to address here tonight is what exactly is that kapara, and I think what we'll have to add here is very important. Okay, so really to understand what I'm trying to present here, we really have to look at the passage of Heta Egel itself, right? We can't try to argue that the Mishkan is coming b'ikvot Heta Egel if we're not really going to look at the text of Heta Egel itself. So that's in source 2. Vayar ha'am ki boshesh Moshe laredet min ha'ar, vayikahel ha'am al Aharon, vayomeru elav kum aselanu Elohim asher yelechu lefanenu, כי זה משה האיש אשר העלנו מארץ מצרים לא ידענו מהילדו. Okay, the nation saw that Moshe slowed to come down from the mountain, and the Am congregated upon Aharon, and they said to him, make for us a God that shall walk before us, because Moshe, the man, the mortal, who brought us out of Egypt. We don't know what happened to him. So Aharon then responds. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this passage, but I think it's important that we read it anyway. Give me the golden rings that you guys have, for all your family members. They take out their golden jewelry, and they bring it to Aharon. ויסר אותו בחרת, ויעשהו עגל מסכה, ויאמרו אלה אלוהיך ישראל אשר עלוך מארץ מצרים. Okay, I think that's all that we have to read for now. Then Aharon, takes this material, this gold, and he turns it into an Egel Masecha. And he says to Bnei Israel, these are these are the God or the gods that took you out of Egypt. Now, when really this is really, if the class tonight was about Heda Egel, there would be much more to say here, but really this is a class about the Mishkan. So I'm not going to spend too much time getting down into all the details here of this passage. But one important discussion here is really what is the nature of Heda Egel, right? Amongst the, even within the Gemara and then in the Rishonim, there's really a mahloket as to what is the nature of Heda Egel. There's basically on a spectrum from Avodah Zarah Mamash, meaning to say that when I say Mamash, I mean that, it was a separate deity, meaning there's Yod-Ke Vav-Ke, and in addition to Yod-Ke Vav-Ke, they crafted this egel, and they assigned to this egel the symbolism of some other deity that's not Yod-Ke Vav-Ke. That would be the most extreme version of Avodah Zarah that we could find here. On the other side of the spectrum, we could find what is probably the most quote-unquote lenient, the most the less harsh explanation of the Heda Egel, which we could really find in the Kuzari, that no, it wasn't a separate deity. Well, it's actually not true. This is really a middle approach. I'll explain why. It wasn't a separate deity that Bnei Israel tried to create. Rather, they were trying to make iconography, so to speak, that this ego were to represent Yod-Ke Vav-Ke. Now, on the most extreme side of the spectrum, if we look at the text once more, and there's a strong argument to be made here, however, I don't think this is correct, and I'll explain why. People try to argue, they're saying, okay, we're trying to replace Moshe. We're not trying to place God. So clearly, they're not trying to make a new God. They're trying to make a new Moshe, and Moshe wasn't a God to them. Now, I don't think that's correct. I think the whole point what Bnei Israel is telling Aharon is that Moshe, the man, Moshe is mortal, who took us out of Egypt. We don't know what happened. And therefore he's insufficient. Because why? He went up to the mountain. It's been some time. We know later it turns out it's been 40 days or so. We don't know what happened to him. For all we know, he could die. He is mortal. And therefore, Aseh lanu Elohim. If that in order to make that clear, I'm arguing that really they're not just asking for a replacement for Moshe. They're saying they're asking for upgrade for Moshe. Moshe is not sufficient because he's merely mortal. In any event, I think the most correct approach of the approaches that we listed here is really what I claimed is the Kuzari's approach. This is an iconography, this issue of iconography, and this will be very important because when we're discussing the Keruvim, right, the Kuzari really compares and contrasts the Keruvim and Heda Egel, and we'll get into that more detailed. But for now, just keep in mind that when I refer to Heda Egel, I'm really within the approach that this is iconography, what's going on here. They're trying to refer to God. Now, again, if I'm arguing, the question that we should have in mind here as we're exploring these texts is there's really two questions here. The first question is a more technical question, a literary question, which perhaps may be proper for the next year, or which, like we discussed last week, is going to be about Hatzaga, which is going to be the presentation. But nonetheless, the first question is, I argue that there's, on the second layer of legislation, there's the kapara on the one hand, and on the other hand, and we're going to try to offer an answer as to why they are not together, meaning either both of them should be integrated into the original legislation, or both of them should be saved for after. That's one question I want to have in mind. Other question is, now I'm arguing this is a response to Heta Egel. I want to more deeply address in what way it is a response to Heta Egel. Okay, in order to do so, I want to remind you all of something that I mentioned last week, which is the Keruvim. I argued to you last week, I should show you a picture. I think I brought right. I argued to you last week that here we have, you guys see the Aron, yeah? We have the Keruvim on top of the Aron, on top of the Kaporet. And there's really two Keruvim, and they're each facing each other. My argument to you was that the Keruvim here are in essence being Shomer Derech Hashem, as we find the Keruvim also in the early chapters of Genesis. They share a similar function. Now, in order to broaden that claim and broaden really what the Keruvim here are doing, I want to look at a few other texts that have, the Azkara mention of Keruvim, as well as another text that mention of a similar passage to Hita Egel, which is Perek Yod Bet of Melachim Aleph, where Yarob'am, who was the first king of Mamlechet Israel, Mamlechet Ephraim, he also, like Bnei Israel and Midbar, creates an Egel, except for him it's not one Egel, it's two Agalim. And what I really want to see from this text here is really bring out what exactly is Yarov'am's goal. And what I'm going to say now is really, I have to say it in the name of my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Yaakov Medan. Of course, I'm not saying what he's saying word for word. And if, of course, it's coming, from he is the source, but of course it's coming through me, so it might be different than what he originally had said. In any event, I want to read with you this text, Melachim Aleph Yod Bet. Vayibn Yarob'am et Shechem, Behar Ephraim vayishev ba vayishev misham vayibn et Penuel vayomer Yarob'am belibo atat tashuv hamamlacha lebeth David. So Yarob'am is in his early stages of his monarchy, of his kingdom, and he is concerned, right? He just split from Yehuda, from Shlomo. Well, not Shlomo, his son Rehoboam, and he's concerned that the nation is going to go, as we'll continue reading. If the his concern is that the Mikdash is in Yehuda, right? It's in between Yehuda and Binyamin, but nonetheless, in terms of the kingdom, it's in the kingdom of Rehoboam. And since Shlomo built the Mikdash, and really since there was a Mishkan, there's a Mishnah discussing when the Mutar Mutar nonetheless, but when there is a centralized place of worship, what the nation is used to, they go, they have the regalim. Even if it's not a regal, they have a korban they want to bring. They're going to go to Yerushalayim, and then they're going to see all their friends. They're going to see what's going on. They're going to see that it's at Yerushalayim, and they're going to really want to reunite with Yehuda, and they're going to kill me. There's going to be an uprising against this revolution of Mamlechet Ephraim. Therefore, this Melech Yarob'am, he needs to make a plan. So he gets advice, and what does he do? He makes two golden calves. You don't need to go to Yerushalayim. I want to just know, again, we're not studying Melachim, but I want to just be sensitive to text. Rab Lachem. I wonder if anyone here, does the words Rab Lachem have any other texts that ring in your ears? For me, it's Korah, right? But we're not telling. We won't go down that path. But what I'm saying here is deeply connected to what's going on with Korah. It's very similar, right? Just to say the Rashi Perakim of the connection to Korah, right? Korah sees that there's a centralized worship, there's the Kohanim, there's Moshe, centralized power, etc. And he says, so similarly, Yaroam, is saying, there doesn't need to be centralized worship. Why? Because these are the gods of, these are your God, Israel, that brought you out of Mitzrayim. He puts one in Bet El and one in Dan. If you're familiar with the map of Mamlechet Ephraim, you'll notice that is the borders of Ephraim. One of the southmost part of Ephraim and one of the northmost part. Now, Rav Medan explains that what exactly is the purpose of putting these agalim, really, enveloping the entire map of Mamlechet Ephraim with these agalim. So Rav Medan explains based on the following texts. For example, Tehillim Pebet, Ro'ai Israel ha'azina nuheg kason Yosef Yoshev ha'kerubim hofia. That God in the Mikdash, right, so to speak, the Shekhinah is Shora ben ha'kerubim. In between the Keruvim, that is where there is Shekhinah. So therefore, what does Yarob'am do? Yarob'am says, they're going to go seek out the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is in between the Keruvim. As we mentioned last week, I showed you support that the Agalim, that the Keruvim, are really the form of a shor. I also mentioned that I personally have some, doubt about the visibility of this option, but nonetheless, within that assumption, what Yarob'am here is doing is he's putting his Kerubim and saying, where, God is Shochen in between the Kerubim. So where is God Shochen? In all of Mamlechet Ephraim. No longer do you need to go to Yerushalayim to find where God is Shochen between the Kerubim. Here, in amongst the entire land of Israel, God is Shochen. And therefore, the Memlechet Ephraim, the people of Memlechet Ephraim, do not need to go to Yerushalayim to be Dorei Shekhinah, to be Zoveach bechule. I brought you a few more examples. Both using the expression Yoshev HaKeruvim, meaning to say that God is Shoreh Shekhinah in between the Keruvim. Now, for our purposes, what I want to bring out of this is the fact that if I'm arguing that the Kerubim are a corrective measure to Hayta Egel, I would like to argue that putting the Kerubim in the Mikdash really serves a dual function. On the one hand, you'll notice that when Bnei Israel engage with the sin of Hayta Egel, what do? They point to the Keruvim, so to speak, or the Keruv in that case, and they say, El Elohecha Israel, that is God. Right? And you put it in the Mikdash, and the corrective measure is you put it in the Mikdash or in the Mishkan, and you say, you have two of them, one each facing the other, and you say in between that is where the Shekhinah is, right? It's in essence, the Keruvim are pointing at something else, and that is exemplifying the fact that God, of course, is not portrayed as an icon, right? There is no iconography in the Mishkan. The Keruvim are not God. The Keruvim are pointing to the Shekhinah. They face each other and they're pointing to the Shekhinah in essence. And I would like to argue that that is really the corrective measure, that instead of pointing to the Kerub itself and saying, El Elohecha Israel, instead you point to what's in between the Kerubim. And that is where the Shekhinah is Torah. And I want to address exactly what is in between these two Keruvim. And I think that will be very, very insightful for us to understand the second Megama here within in adding the Kaporet to the Mishkan after Hayta Egel. Now, I'm here in Shemot Kafeh, where we have the legislation of the Kaporet. I'd like to read it with you. Ve'asita Kaporet zahav tahor, amatayim v'chesi orka, ve'ama v'chesi rochba. Ve'asita shenayim kerubim zahav, miksha ta'aseh otam, mishene kesot HaKaporet. Ve'aseh kerub echad, mikaseh mizeh, uchrub echad, mikasa mizeh. מן הכפורת תעשו את הקירובים על שני כסותיו. והיו הקירובים פורשי כנפיים למעלה, שוחחים בכנפיהם על הכפורת, ופניהם איש אל אחיו. אל הכפורת יהיו פני הקירובים. ונתת את הכפורת על הארון מלמעלה, ואל הארון תיתן את העדות אשר אתן אליך. ונודעתי לך שמה, ודיברתי איתך מעל הכפורת, מבין שני הקירובים. Again, you don't need to Ramadan, it's really the Forash of the Pesukim, in between the two Kerubim. Asher al Aron Haidut, et kol asher asave otecha el bnei Israel. Now, my argument here is, I bolded, Natatat kaporet al ha'aron milma'la ve'el ha'aron titen et ha'idut asher titen elech. My argument to you all tonight is that really, what are the Kerubim pointing to? The Kerubim are pointing to the Luchot HaBerit. The Kerubim are pointing to the fact that through covenant, that is where we could find Shekhinah. In essence, my argument to you is as follows. Hayta Egel was almost the ultimate antinomian event in Israel, in Bnei Israel's history. And here the Keruvim come as a corrective measure as such. Not just, going back to Yerushalmi, Yavok Zahav Shel Kaporet V'chaper al Zahav Shel Hayta Egel. It's not just like a Gezerah Shava Zahav Zahav. It's a lot more deep than that. It's an educational kapara, that you have the Kerubim here, and the Kerubim are pointing to the Luchot. They're pointing to the Aron, and that is the merkaz of religious life in the Torah's view, that again, taking the Hayta Egel, where they pointed to the Agalim, that is God. Instead, the Agalim, so to speak, are pointing to the Luchot and say, there is God. I hope that is clear. If not, I'd very happy if someone can, any questions, Adkan? No. Okay, very good. So again, I show you here the picture, and my argument again is that you have the Kerubim on both sides, and in the middle we say that is where God is Shoreh Shekhinah, and what is in the middle of that is where Luchot HaBerit are placed. Okay. Okay, Shemot Lamed. Now, with that in mind, before that, okay. Let's read, no, okay. With that in mind, I want to really address the two questions that I posed in the beginning of this. Again, the first question was the literary question of Mizbach HaKetoret and the Kaporet, why are they separated literarily? And the second question are what are their responses? I got two. more or less what I want to say regarding the Kiruvim. I want to now address the Mizbach HaZahav, and I think through looking at the different magamot in the Mizbach HaZahav and the Kaporet, we could really understand why they're separated literarily. Now, as I pointed out to you, my argument about the Kaporet, that they're coming to show, they're coming to reinforce the ultimate goal of the Mishkan, right? As I argued last week, the ultimate goal of the Mishkan was a place of meeting, a place of hiva'adut between God and Israel. And therefore, and that is the makom haberit, and therefore the ultimate, as everyone notices, the first keli of the Mishkan that's presented is the aron haberit, and now the kirubim are there to reinforce that after the ultimate antinomian breach of Heta Egel. So in essence, the kaporet is reinforcing what was already there. However, Mizbach HaKetoret, I would like to suggest, serves almost as a counter theme to everything that's going on in the Mishkan. Let me explain what I want to say, what I mean. What I mean to say is that, in essence, the entirety of the Mishkan, the purpose is, like I said, hiva'adut, the meeting place. It's kirva, right? We bring korbanot, milashon karob, lehit karev. And I would like to argue that Mizbach Miktar Ketoret almost serves the exact opposite purpose. We see from Vayikra Tetvav in the Avodah of Yom Kippurim that Ketoret often serves as a smokescreen, almost as a step back. Right after the ultimate antinomian breach, which is Heta Egel, there's two responses. On the one hand, you need to reinforce the centrality, the merkazut of the Berit and the Luchot Berit in the Mishkan. On the one hand, and on the other hand, we need to take a step back. After the Shelihat Yad of Bnei Israel, so to speak, to God, that was inappropriate. The Mizbach HaKetoret symbolizes step back. How the religious experience of covenantal people is one of a constant state of ga'gua, of a mehakeh, meaning to say that, through covenant you could get close to God, but anything past that, that's already, you think you're getting closer to God, but it's really being mitrah, you're really getting further from God. And that's what the Mizbach HaKetoret represents. The Mizbach HaKetoret represents a smokescreen, somewhat of a separation. And I think what I just said can really explain to us the original kushya we had, which is why they separated textually. Because I'm arguing that although on a time level, the Kaporet and the Mizbach HaKetoret were introduced at the same time, the Kaporet really is reinforcing the same goal as the rest of the Mishkan, while the Mizbach HaKetoret really has a counter theme, and therefore it's saved for last. The Mishkan, so to speak, is shalem without the Mizbach HaKetoret, and its goal of Hiva'adut Shalem without Mizbach HaKetoret. Mizbach HaKetoret, however, after the ultimate breach of Heta Egel, you need to really in law show the step back and the fact that you can't always go where you want to go, so to speak. Is that clear? Any kushiyot about that? Okay, if not, I just want to mention in passing two other explanations. I don't really think these explanations are very helpful or sufficient. Not helpful, but I don't think they're correct. But I'll mention them nonetheless. My teacher, Moshe Shama, he argues that, I believe he writes this in Reforming the Covenant, but he's definitely said to me in person that he argues that really Mizbach HaKetoret perhaps was added not just in response to Heta Egel, but also in response to Het Nadav ve'Avihu. The argument would be as follows, that you almost combine the sins of Nadav ve'Avihu, which is Ketoret, right? They brought Esh Zara, and they brought a Ketoret, Asher Lo Siva Otam, an anti-nomian as well, breach, and Heta Egel, another antinomian breach. You combine those two and you get Mizbach HaKetoret. And therefore, that would explain to us why it's presented even later, because while the Kaporet was added immediately after the Heta Egel, Mizbach HaKetoret was only added on a third Shelav, which would be after Nadav ve'Avihu. I don't think this is very convincing. I don't think it's feasible at all, because on Yom HaShemini itself, the Mizbach HaKetoret is mentioned. So really, in order to swallow this approach, you have to really reorganize a lot and kind of say there's insertions everywhere, more or less, even into the actual legislation as to what to do in Yom HaShemini, and I don't really think that's feasible. Just one more point I want to mention, which I also don't think is very. It's not that it's not convincing. There's just not enough evidence. I'm showing you here a picture of there's tons of these pictures. Go to Israel Museum, you could see tons of these kinds of figures. More or less, most of the avodah zarah that you could find in the Israel Museum is a bull or a calf or something of that sort with a cup in which to serve incense. So the suggestion would perhaps be that the Hayta Egel, really the sin of the Hayta Egel itself was not just, you have the Keruvim on the one hand, you also have Ketor to put on the Keruvim. I don't think there's enough evidence for that. I'll just leave that there as an aside, as a maybe, and that's really the first part of the shiur. Just to summarize what we said at Kan, I presented really two magamot within the response to Hayta Egel, because really it's corresponding to two problems in Hayta Egel. The two problems are the antinomian breach of iconotry on the one hand. The Keruvim come to point to a covenantal system, which everything needs to be regulated, and of course there is no iconotry in the system. These icons, so to speak, aren't referring in any way or symbolizing God, but rather are pointing to something else, which is obviously, it's matzbia on the fact that they are not God. So by bringing in the agalim into the mikdash, and you put, you can't really see them all the time because you have the parochet. Nonetheless, by legislating them, when we study the Torah, when we study this text, we can see that it's matzbia on something else. The Shekhinah is shora ben hakeruvim and not in the keruvim, has v'shalom. And that's that. And the Ketoret, once more, is serving as a smokescreen, serving as a step back, a counter theme, antithesis, so to speak, to the Mishkan, which is Karvut, and the Mizbach HaKetoret serves as a step back. Now, just one more, B'shulei Dvarim, I just want to note that the Kaporet, if you are sensitive to the phonetics of that word, obviously resembles the word kapara. And just, that's another important thing to note within our conversation. Okay, that's Adkan for the first part of the shiur. The second part of the shiur, I really want to get on to the Ofi of the Mishkan, or what I called before the Mahut, but I think Ofi is a better word. And I really want to present two approaches here. Again, I think it's obvious we're in the Habura, right? So it's obvious which approach I'm going to take. And this will take us, hopefully, for the rest of our time tonight. Okay, so the Ofi of the Mishkan. I wrote here, the Mishkan, or ritual more generally. Is that something that is covenantally symbolic, or some sort of mechanistic metaphysical realism? What I mean to say here is, I think these terms are clear, but just in case they're not, covenantal symbolism would mean that, there's nothing inherent about the Mishkan, right? The Mishkan has many different, objects, many different features, many different markivim in Hebrew. And these different features, different objects, different markivim, contain different symbolic components, but there's nothing, quote unquote, real. There's nothing that they're trying. It's not an animation of something. We're not trying to bring something down that already really exists in some realm or another. However, there is an approach that you could find that people try to really explain the Mishkan as some sort of mechanistic metaphysical realism. Now, I'm going to try to prove in the remaining time I have tonight that Torah's approach is very clear, that we're dealing here with covenantal symbolism and not mechanistic metaphysical realism. Now, the first place I want to go is Vayikra Perek Tet. Vayikra Perek Tet, if you recall, this is Perashat Shemini. Right, Perashat Shemini. Now, in this Perek, we could find a very, very important structure that is important to know, really, without in any part of the legislation of the Torah, when there's legislation and during the legislation. It's, these are my terminology, I'm sure other people use them as well. Sivui and bisua, right? In English, instruction and fulfilling. I don't really know how to say bisua in English. Carrying out the instruction, so to speak. Now, very often when you have a sivui bisua structure, very important is to be sensitive to any differences in the Bitsua, any surprises even. Now, I highlighted, there's always a question whenever you're making one of these charts, to what extent the colors are helpful or distracting. I asked a few people, all people told me it was helpful. I hope that it is helpful, not distracting. Now, just to explain what I did here on this chart, I try to show you how everything in the Bitsua, right, part of this text corresponds directly to something in Tzivui until we get to this later box of Pasuk Kaf Bet and Kaf Gimal, where we're hit with a surprise. And I would like to explain how what's really going on here is, again, when we use the word polemic, there's really kind of two kinds of polemics. There's an intended polemic, right? Torah is really polemicizing with something purposefully, or maybe it's just obvious to the Torah, but when you have already when you're conscious of another approach that we're arguing the Torah is not taking, you could also take this as a second kind of polemic. In any event, let's just read through this text. Tet bet, right? Vayomer el Aharon. Kach lecha echel ben bakar lehatat. So blue from here in this chart is going to be hatat. Ve'ayel le'olat tamimim. Ve'akrev b'fnei Adonai. ואל בני ישראל תדבר לאמור, כיחו שעיר עזים לחטאת, ועגל וחפץ בן שנה תמימים לעולם, ושור ועיל לשלמים, לזבוח לבני אדוני, ומנחה בלולה בשמן, כי היום אדוני נראה לכם. Okay. Then Pasuk, which you could find here on the Bisua, ויקחו את אשר סבה משה אל פניו המועד, ויקרבו כל העדה ויעמדו לפני אדוני. Sorry. So you could see here, right, that והקרב קח לך ויקחו את אשר סבה משה אל פניו המועד, exactly what they were told to do, ויקרבו כל העדה ויעמדו לפני אדוני, ויקרב לפני אדוני. Okay, עד כאן. Next. So that's hint. Now we're on Vav. Now, when we're reading this text, it's almost possible that we would be able to read this text that it's almost automatic. You do these things, X, Y, and Z, and then, the glory of God is going to appear before you. ועשה את חטאתך ואת עולתך, וכפר בעדך ובעד העם, ועשה את קורבן העם וכפר בעדם כאשר ציווה אדוני. Okay, now Tethet, where Shuv we could see very clearly that everything's corresponding to the Sivui. ויקרב אהרון אל המזבח, קרב אל המזבח, וישחט את עגל חטאת אשר לו. That would be here. ויקריבו בני אהרון את הדם אליו ויטבול אצבעו בדם ויתן על קרנות המזבח ואת הדם יסק אל יסוד המזבח ואת החלב ואת הכליות ואת מן הכבד מן החטאת יקטיר המזבחה כאשר דבר למועד את משה ואת הבשר ואת העור שרף באש מחוץ למחנה. Okay, that's his חטאת. Now יוד בית. וישחט העולה וימסיעו בני אהרון אליו את הדם ויזרקו על המזבח סביב. Sorry, I didn't translate. I hope what's going on here is clear. I'll just summarize in case not. Haron approached the Mizbeach and he slaughtered the calf that was for the Hatat offering. Hope again, this series Shiurim is also going to address Korbanot. So I'm not going to translate the names of the offerings. It's really going to be something we're going to address in detail in a further Shiur. So for now, it's called Hatat offering. And Bnei Aharon brought forward the blood to Aharon, and Aharon dipped his finger in the blood and he put it around the corners of the altar, and he poured the blood also in the Yesod HaMizbeach. The Yesod HaMizbeach, imagine the Mizbeach is a rectangle and there's different layers. So I should have brought a picture. Anyway, if you know what the Yesod HaMizbeach is, but it's not crucial for us right now. Right, the fats and what we call emurim min hatat tiktir mizbecha, right? Kasher seva Adonai et Moshe, and the basar, meaning the hatat. We haven't yet learned what we haven't yet. So the text of the Torah has already presented it, but we haven't yet studied together the process of the hatat. This is a regular hatat, like we would have expected. Okay, then we have the olah, similarly exactly what we would have expected. Tetvav vayakrev korban ha'am. That was his korban, and then we have korban ha'am. Vayikach se'ir hatat asher la'am. Vayishhateu karishon. Vayakrev ha'olah vayasek mishpat. Good. Everything is done exactly as expected. Then also we have here the minha of the am, right here. If you see here minha, and then we have our minha here. Vayakrev et haminha. Vaymalech hapo miminna. Vayakter al mizbeach milevad olat haboker. Okay, now we have the shelamim, right, which we could find here. And again, they do the processes exactly as we would have expected, right? Okay, now here's where we get to what we call the hafta'ah, the surprise within the bisua. Tet kaf bet. We didn't hear anything about beracha. Yes, I know. In Bet Midrash we have Kot Baruch Bnei Israel more than but we don't know that yet. וירד מעשות חטאת והעולה והשלמים. ויבוא משה ואהרון אל המועד ויסעו וילכו את העם. Now again, there's another thing. Not only did we not hear about this beracha, Aaron did a beracha, then Moshe and Aaron go back in, they do another beracha, that's also strange. Another, what's Moshe doing here? In any event, only then el kol ha'am. Now, I would like to read, I think that the appropriate reading of this passage is, and I think you could find this in the really one of the most beautiful midrashim I've ever seen quoted in Rashi, really beautiful language. I want to read it with you. דבר אחר, כיוון שראה אהרון שקרבו כל הקורבנות ונעשו כל המעשים ולא ירדה שכינה לישראל, היה עומד ומסתער בו. אמר, יודע אני שכעס הקדוש ברוך הוא עליי ובשבילי לא ירדה שכינה. Okay. I would like to argue here in lines with what Rashi is saying. I'll translate Rashi. Because Aharon saw that all the korbanot were brought, all the ma'asim, Moshe detailed very clearly exactly what they're supposed to do. We did everything. And the Shekhinah, well, they didn't come down. Again, Moshe says, you do this, Ki b'yom hazeh nirah Adonai alechem. Sorry, ki hayom Adonai nirah alechem, or what we have later, or early in the text. In any event, it's almost like the text here is building up a climax. There's an expectation, they do all the korbanot, and then there's a bump on the road, so to speak. There's something unexpected. Aaron does beracha. What's this beracha about? And then the beracha seems to not be effective because only after Moshe and Aaron do the beracha together, only then the Chabod Hashem appears to all of the nation. Now, again, like I said, this is almost like the climax, and it kind of and you expect to hit the climax. You're raising up to the climax, but the climax doesn't come. There's only there's a dip down, and then only then do you get to the climax. Now, I'd like to argue in lines with what the Mefarshim here are saying. I want to read further in Rashi. Right? Amar lo Moshe, kach asit ali he became embarrassed. We told everyone we're going to do the Yemei Miluim 7 days, and there's an 8th day, and then we do all these things. We do everything, and then the Shekhinah is coming, and right, and then the Shekhinah didn't come. Moshe went in and he asked Rachamim from God, he asked for mercy, and the Shekhinah came down in front of Israel. What I'm trying to bring out of here is that there's nothing mechanistic here, right? You have to ask, we don't know. Part of the Toda'ah, part of the, I don't know a good English word for Toda'ah, the mindset, so to speak, of Bnei Israel and covenant with God, is that there's nothing here that's automatic. There's always at the back of your head, and really, Professor Yoni Grossman, he writes in his book in Bereshit that the story of Cain Vahevel, part of its purpose in Bereshit is almost an introduction to Korbanot, and he argues that there's no reason presented in the story of Cain Vahevel to explain why Cain's Korban wasn't accepted. It should have been accepted, and part of the Toda'ah that is milaveh, sorry, I've been living in Israel for a few years. My English isn't what it once was. Anyway, Melaveh, the Makriv, is this Toda'ah that we're going to offer the Korbanot, we're going to try to have this Mishkan, but at the end of the day, is God going to accept this? Is God going to be Shoreh Shekhinah? We don't know. We don't know. And that's the opposite of mechanistic, right? Mechanistic, if the clocks are working, if the gears are running, then, what happens is supposed to happen. Shuv, Vaisu Vayalchu Ta'am. Amru, what is this beracha? V'hinoam Adonai Eloheinu alenu. Yehi rashon shetishrei shechina ma'aseh yedechem. לפי שכל שיבעתי מילים שהעמיד משה למשכן, שימש בו ברכו בכל יום ויום, ולא שלטה בו שכינה. והיו ישראל נכלמים ואומרים למשה רבנו, כל הדור שטרחנו, שתשרה שכינה בינינו, ונדע שתקפל לנו מעשה העגל. Right? They were, every day they were, it was disappointing because they were told they were supposed to do all these things, and the Shekhinah was coming in, and it didn't come. לפיכך אמר להם, זה הדבר שצווה אדוני תעשו ועליך כבוד אדוני לכם. אחי אהרון כדאי וחשוב ממני שעל ידי קורבנותיו ועבודתו תשרה שכינה בכם ותדעו שהמקום בחר בו. Okay, I want to look further at Ibn Azar, Rashbam, Bechol Shol, Shadal, all basically saying the same thing. Source 3, Bahar Ken, Ba Moshe v'Aharon el Ohel Moed. Vayitechen sheba'u litpalel ala eshet eseh. You need a tefillah. There's nothing automatic here. You do the korbanot. The korbanot are part of a sacrificial rite that have covenantal significance and symbolism, as Be'ezrat Hashem, I hope we get to address in the future. But none of that's automatic. the tefillah is, it's almost necessary, so to speak, because tefillah, it's not necessary, but the point of the adding tefillah is to show that there's nothing here that's mechanistic. Also, similarly, וירד אש מן השמיים, שיוודע שתקבלה העבודה, שדל. ויבוא משה ואהרון אל אוהל מועד, ויסעו וברכו את העם. אחר שעבד אהרון עבודתו נכנס משה עמו, כביכול. And here this is, Shadal, again, he's a very late commentator, so, his words are, not that they're less valuable, but, in any event. כביכול, לעמידו לפני המלך לבקש מלפניו שירסהו. Moshe basically presented Aharon in front of God, asking that he accept him, like we say in the Tefillah. Or maybe he'll hear, no, Aharon, sorry, you were rejected. ואז נתבשר היותו רצוי לפניו, והורשה לברך את העם, ואז יעשו וברכו את העם, מיד נראה כבוד השם. Again, the same theme that I'm trying to bring out here is that there's nothing automatic. There's tefillah, there's safek, and that's really a fundamental component of the mindset that is really that's melaveh, the worshiper in front of God, that you never know, right? You never know what's going to happen. You never know whether what you're trying to do is going to be mitkabel. Maybe God's going to reject it. Maybe God's going to, you don't know. Now, that being said, we have a covenantal system. It's not a free-for-all. If it was a free-for-all, then you really wouldn't know. Kain v'Hevel, it was their own initiative to bring korbanot. They really didn't know whether it was going to be accepted or not. We have something of a deal with God that, God tells us, you do this and this, and, I'll do this and this. But even in this covenantal framework, there's still this suffix whether it's going to be rasui, whether it's going to be accepted. And that's why, we have this tefillah, we think about it, we say it every day. This tefillah, a lot of people think that this tefillah was instituted only because there's no mikdash. No, when the mikdash was there, that's really when you need to say it. That, the avodah is going to be mitkabel berason, because it's not muvan me'alav at all. Okay, now just to summarize that point, I tried to show here in Vayikra Tet how there's the structure of the Sibui and the Bisuah, there's the surprise, there's the climax that was expected that took some time to get there, and the theme that I'm trying to bring out here is the non-mechanistic form that the Korbanot and Mishkan at large hold. This is a really nice Tanhuma, which is really relevant to us. I will note, for sake of intellectual honesty, you could find another position, which is really the opposite position in this Tanhuma. But I want to address this piece of this Tanhuma. Ele Fekudeh HaMishkan. The first Tanhuma in Parashat Pekudeh. זה שאמר הכתוב, כיסא כבוד, מרום, מראשון, מקום מקדשנו, שם מכוון מקדשנו. וכן הוא אומר, מאחרון שבטך פעלת השם, מקדש אדוני כל ידיך, וכן אתה מוצא שירושלים מכוונת למעלה, כמו ירושלים של מטה. מרוב אהבתה של מטה, עשה אחרת למעלה, שנאמר, הן על כפיים חכותיך, עמותייך נגדי תמיד. Now, it may sound not so, when I read this text, it's a big blast, because you could find a lot, even in rabbinic literature, you could find it, using the word rabbinic literature more broadly. You could find it in the Ramban, really in the Ramban on Perek Lamed in Shemot, which is addressing Mizbach HaKetoret. He's also asking the question, why is the Mizbach HaKetoret brought out of the general Ma'arechet of the Mishkan? And he answered, because of the Mishkan Shel Ma'ala, and we're trying, and really Kasuta, I'll read you, I didn't bring the Ramban, I brought Kasuta, who basically says the same thing in more clear words. Because if we contrast that with what we're going to read here, that's true, God showed Moshe the Tavnit of the Mishkan, and Kasut here is going to try to draw out from the fact that Hashem is showing Moshe the Tavnit of Mishkan that actually exists in Shamayim, with Tavnit Kilav. Perush hadavar shechaza Moshe b'machzeh nebu'i את מושב האלוהים אשר בשמיים, ומוטל היה עליו להקים בתוך מחנה ישראל משכן דומה לסורה שראה במחזהו. מקדש של מטה מקביל מקדש של מעלה. If you see here, this is the exact opposite approach we could find in Tanhuma. Tanhuma is the opposite, right? This approach would be, what Kasuta was presenting here is more or less arguing the fact that that there is some sort of realism here, that there's something that is inherent. God has his Moshav Eloki, and we're trying to mimic that. But however, in the Tanakh we find the exact opposite relationship between the Mikdash Shel Mala and Mikdash Shel Mata. The Mikdash Shel Mala as a Hekui is an imitation of the Mikdash Shel Mata. Merov, from God's great love of the Mishkan, the Bnei Israel, built within the covenantal system. Again, I don't think we need to take this Mikdash literally, that God literally built the Mikdash Lamala. But the point is that it's rejecting the notion that it's a hikui of something that's up in the upper realms, that we're trying to bring something down to the upper realms. Rather, we through our covenant, we have instruction. We have instruction to create this machon shiftecha, and that's the ikar. Now that we're trying to, not do something real. This is covenantal. This is symbolic. Okay, I hope that's clear. Another discussion that I think we could make relevant to our discussion here about the nature of the Mishkan as covenantally symbolic and not metaphysical mechanism, mechanics and realism, is a discussion amongst Hazal regarding Shabbat and the Mishkan. In order to have this conversation, I want to read to you the Pesukim, which are the beginning of Parashat Vayakhel. Okay. Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat bnei Israel vayomer alehem. By the way, we're going to come back to this text Be'ezrat Hashem next week. There's a lot more to say about this text, but I really want to bring one part out of it, 1 point out of it. Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat bnei Israel vayomer alehem. Ele devarim asher tzivah Adonai la'achozotam. So Moshe congregated the nation, the entire nation, and he said to them, these are the things that God commanded to do. By the way, just a very, very small note. If you note the word Vayakhel, it might recall to you the word that we found in Shemot Lamed Aleph, right? Lamed Aleph, Vayikahadu al Aharon. In any event, we'll probably address that next week. In any event, here is what God said to do. Shesh domim te'aseh melacha. V'yom ha-shebi'i yihye lachem kodesh. Shabbat Shabbaton l'Adonai. Kol ha'oseh bo melacha yumat. 6 days you do work. 7th day, it should be Kodesh you, Shabbat Shabbaton, to God, it's a day of rest. Anyone who does Melacha dies. Lo tevaruesh, don't make fire, don't burn fire in all of your dwellings on Shabbat. Then, if you notice, there's a structure here. Okay. יביעיה את תרומת אדוני, זהב וכסף ונחושת. This is basically the first time Bnei Israel is hearing about the Mishkan. This is the first time Moshe is presenting the Mishkan to Bnei Israel. Do it. And the Tanhuma, this is very famous. I'm sure you've all heard about this. Heard this formulation in one form or another. Vayakhel Moshe, lama ne'emera parasha zo? Why is this parashiyah of Shabbat of Vayakhel said here? The Fishu Omer va'asu l'mikdash. Shomea ani ben bechol ben b'Shabbat. So there's an instruction, there's an imperative. Make for me a temple. So I would hear from that. Could be done on Shabbat. It could be whole. There's an absolute imperative. However, we have another imperative. Anyone who anyone who is mehalel, anyone who makes desecrates the Shabbat, shall be put to death. I would have said, yeah, no, that's referring about everything other than Mishkan. Right? So no, it's not an absolute imperative. You do the mikdash every day other than Shabbat, or after Shabbat. Oh, maybe here. This is a very classic rabbinic structure of a dialectic and midrash halacha. Right? Is it this or is it this? And there's laptut back and forth. Oh, right. Is the imperative that's absolute to build the mikdash or to not violate Shabbat? Right? So maybe you make mikdash every day other than Shabbat or after Shabbat. ומה עבודה שאינה באה אלא מכוח המכשירים, הרי הוא דוחה את שבת. מכשירי עבודה שאין להם מלוא מכוחן, אינו דין שידחו את השבת. כגון שתלה קרנו של מזבחי, כמה הסכין, שומעני יתקנם בשבת. Right? They try to make a kal vachomer that, even a hechsher mitzvah of the avodah. You need to fix one of the kelim or the knife or whatever. It doesn't matter for our purposes. In any event, we say that's Dohe Shabbat. So dinoten, building the Mishkan gufa, that should also. So how do we know? Not Shneimar Vayakel Moshe Bechol Velo B'Shabbat. Now, what is the purpose of this Tanhuma? I don't think that the purpose of this Tanhuma is purely halach, meaning say that the Mishkan was a sivui l'dorot. They're not dealing Hazal here with an actual practical question of whether right now we're building the Mishkan, should we do it on Shabbat or not. This is not the practical question. There's many midrashei halacha that you need an answer to, but this is not one of them because there's no longer relevant. So what's the purpose here? I really would like to argue that this has to do with our conversation with Mishkan as a detail, as a perat within the greater ma'arechet of the berit, and not a fundamental. And it's not that it's not fundamental, but it's not omed b'fnei atzmo. It's not self-sustaining. It doesn't stand on its own. It's within a broader context, which is the covenant. And I'd like to read to you again. This is also what I'm about to say is related to something that I believe I heard from my teacher of Yaakov Medan. I asked him this year, just make sure he said it. He claimed to me he didn't say it. He said that he appreciated the idea, but he doesn't think that he said it. I'm pretty sure I heard him say it last year. But in any case, I want to read to you the text Shemot Lamed Aleph, which it doesn't matter. Shemot Lamed Aleph, this is the text right before Chet HaEgel. V'yomar Adonai Moshe lemor, ve'ata daber b'nei Yisrael lemor, achet shebatotai tishmoru, ki oti beni u'benechem l'dorotechem, l'daat ki ani Adonai mekadishchem, u'shmartem Shabbat kodesh yilachem echalel mot yumat, ki kol ha'aseh bah melacha v'nichata nefesh ha'im b'kerev amea. Shesh lemim ya'aseh melacha, u'yom ha'shiv'i Shabbat Shabbaton kodesh Adonai, kol ha'aseh melacha b'yom ha'Shabbat mot yumat. Now here's really the main point what I want to bring out here. Shabbat is the ot berit between God and Israel. And Shabbat, the Hazal say, really, if anyone is mehalel Shabbat, it's like he is mehalel all the mitzvot. They say that about only one other thing, which is avodah zarah, right? Now, what I'm trying to argue here is that the point of the Tanhuma is that the Mishkan, that's a perat of the covenant. But Shabbat, that represents the entirety of the covenant. So to be mehalel Shabbat in order to build the Mishkan, which is nothing other than a detail within the ma'arechet of the berit, it's it doesn't work because it's the only reason why we have Mishkan is because of the berit. And to be mehalel, the thing that symbolizes the berit kula with a perat, would obviously not make so much sense. I'm arguing here again that what we're trying to show here is that the mitzvah of Bet Midrash is not omedet b'fnei asma. It doesn't stand on its own. It stands in a very broad covenant with many mitzvot. And as we'll see, I believe in the next sources, right? Well, next source is that when you take these mitzvot out of the context of berit, they are worthless, more or less. How will I show that? We are all, I'm sure many of us are very familiar with the Nevi'im's hitnagdut, their objections to the sacrificial service in their times. We could, I could have brought many different sources. We don't have time to go through every time the Nevi'im complain about the korbanot. But I brought basically the two most famous ones. So I have Amos, who almost suggests that I think we'll actually see this in passing, that Bnei Israel never brought korbanot in the desert, which is a whole kushya that I think in passing we'll mention tonight. But in any event, I want to read with you Yeshaya Aleph. Shim'u debar Adonai kisine Sedom. Listen to the word of God, chieftains of Sedom. Azinu Torat Elohenu Am Amora. Listen to the instruction of our God, nation of Gomorrah. Lama lirob zibhachem yomar Adonai sabati olot elim v'chelev meriim v'dam parim uchvasim v'atudim lo hafasti. What is it to me, the surplus of zevahim, of zevahim, says God. I'm full. I'm savati olot elim v'chelev meriim. I don't need this. Atudim lo hafasti. I don't want this. Who asked you to come here and trample over my courtyards? Don't Stop bringing your worthless menachot, your ketoret, it's a to'eva, it's an abomination to me. Your Chodesh and your Shabbat, Mikra, the holidays you have, I don't want it. I hated them. פרסכם כפיכם עלים עיניים מכם גם כתרבות תפילה אינני שומע ידיכם דמים מלאו רחסו הזקו הסירו רועב עליכם מנגד עיניי חדלו הרע ילמדו היטב דרשו משפט חמוס שפטו יתום ריבו אלמנה. Now I'm not going to tell the story that many people tell, and God willing, really, B'ezras Hashem, I think either as an introduction to the Korbanot or as an appendix to what we're discussing the Korbanot, I really want to address Harambam. So often Harambam is misrepresented. So often Harambam is misrepresented as saying there's not going to be korbanot. We're not. This is not the topic, but the people misunderstand the Nevi'im the same way they misunderstand Harambam. So he's in good company. In any event, I'm going to argue here that the point here is that when your hands are full of blood not just of the parim that you slaughtered to God, but blood of people that you slaughtered. Right? You're ignoring the entire covenant. And the one thing you're focusing on is the sacrificial service. It's worthless. Because as we mentioned before, sacrificial service is one detail in a very broad system of covenant. And when you take it out of its covenantal framework, it then becomes purposeless. It becomes worthless. Not only worthless, it becomes a ta'ivah. In essence, it could even be said it becomes avodah zarah. Because if it's not part of the instructive command, right? If I were to tell someone to do something, I tell them to do 15 things, and one of those 15 things happens to be something that he wants to do. I tell him do X, Y, Z, and one of those things I tell him watch the football game. And the only thing he does is watch the football game. It's clear that he's not doing it because it's part of this relationship that I have with him. It's not part of a covenant relationship. He's doing it because he wants to do it. And therefore it becomes Torah, and maybe even Avodah Zarah. Similarly, we could find something similar in Yirmiyah Zayin. Also, both of these are Haftarot, right? This is Yeshaya Aleph is Haftarah for, we read it at the end of the year, Hazon Yeshaya. And then Yirmiyah Zayin, we read Tzav, Perashat Tzav, at least Sephardim do. Ko amar Adonai Sevaot Elohei Yisrael. Thus says Lord of the hosts, God of Israel, your burnt offerings, stop. Your zivahim, stop. Eat the meat. I don't need it. I didn't say anything to them about Olav Zabach. כי את הדבר הזה ציוויתי אותם לאמור, שמעו בקולי והייתי לכם אלוהים ואתם תהיו לי לעם, והלכתם בכל הדרך שלכם למען ייטב לכם. ולא שמעו ולא הטו את אוזנם והלכו במעשות משרות ליבם הרע. והיו לאחור ולא לפנים. למן היום אשר יעשו אבותיכם ארץ מצרים עד היום הזה, ואשלח את עליכם את כל עבדי הנביאים, יום השכם ושלוח. ולא שמעו אליי ולא הטו את אוזנם, ויקשו את עורפם, הרעו מאבותם. Now, when you read this text, it's even more extreme than Yeshaya. You have to have some sort of ritial. What are you talking about? I didn't say anything about Olav Zabach. I have Vayikra. I'm about to teach you guys Vayikra. What do you mean I didn't say anything about Olav Zabach? He said a lot of things about Olav Zabach. He said, whole books about Olav Zabach. So I think, again, this text is often misrepresented, misread. I want to explain at least how I believe this text should be read. Again, he didn't say anything about Olav Zabach. What did he say? I'm in Pasuk He. Sorry, I'm in Pasuk Kaf. I don't know what Pasuk I'm in. I believe I'm in Pasuk Kaf Gimel. Yeah, I don't know why there's a head there. Okay. Im et hadabar hazeh siviti otam lemor. What did God say? Shim'u bekoli v'aytim lechem leluhim, the berit. I said, let's create a covenant. V'atem tiyu le'am. The entirety of the covenant is what I instructed you to do. Now, God isn't saying I didn't say, I'm saying again, there's what he says semantically and semiotically. What the way that I believe this text is to be interpreted is that I didn't only say things about korbanot. I said, listen to everything I say. When you isolate the maaseh korbanot, it's worthless. If that was all that there was there, the only thing that I said that you're listening to me is korbanot, then yeah, I didn't say it because it's worthless. If it's not part of the covenantal framework, again, the maaseh korbanot is worthless. Now, of course, Yirmiyah is not saying korbanot are bad. He's not saying God didn't speak about korbanot. He's not saying any of that. What he's saying is that the korbanot have a very important, but they have a very important place in religious life, but they need to be in the covenantal framework. And when they're taken out and they're isolated, it's worthless. All that God said was, I want a covenant with you, Israel. I want to have a covenant with you, and I want to be your God. I want you to be my people. I want to have this relationship through the covenant, and I want you to be. It's good. It will be good for you. And you didn't listen, and all you do is korbanot. Every morning, every evening, you bring the korbanot, and every meeting, in addition, you have musaf on holidays. The musaf on the regular day, they go and kill people, they go and steal people, they torment yatomim, they torment gerim, vechule. Now, again, what I'm trying to bring out is that here you could see very clearly, according to my reading of these texts, that there's nothing here that's mechanistic. There's nothing here that's either mechanistic or metaphysically mechanistic. What we have here is a beautiful Torah, a beautiful covenant that offers a relationship between God and Israel. But this relationship, and therefore this Mishkan, the Maaseh Korbanot, they need to be covenantal. They need to be in this covenantal framework. And when they're taken out of the framework, they are worth nothing. Okay, I don't think we have time for this source. So let's go on to the next thing. Okay, we mentioned we don't need to read this inside because we spoke about this last week. Mishkan Ha'edut. So we mentioned that in one of the approaches of Mishkan, we said that it's a response to Chet HaEgel, like God, it's a way of God being mesamen, making a sign to the fact that he forgave Israel for Chet HaEgel. If that's so, of course, there's nothing metaphysical about that, nothing mechanistic about that. It's a sign. You make the Mishkan, and that is a sign to the fact that God forgave Israel. Okay. Now, here's I think what we're going to spend most of the rest of our time here tonight, which is, I phrased the question, Ma peshet ha'analogiot ben ma'amad Har-Sinai Mishkan. It's very well known, it's very well documented, it's very well written about, that there are a very, very large amount of parallels between Ma'amad Har-Sinai and the Mishkan. Now, what exactly is the way to interpret these parallels? Now, I think the most famous and really maybe even the first person to really address this at length was Ramban Nachmani. And he has his approach, and I want to really be mehazek his approach, but I want to be mehazek his observations, but not his explanations. And let's read, I bolded and highlighted. Let's read what I bolded and highlighted. Okay. V'hine, hem kedoshim, re'uyim sheyeh bahem mikdash la'ashrot shechinato b'nehem. Be it as it may be, that Am Yisrael are Kadosh, they are holy. It is fit that there should be a Mikdash for them, for God to be Shoresh Shekhinah, for God to have a Shekhinah dwell with them. The Ikar, the most important want for the Mishkan, right? The most important for Haramban that he's saying, the most important part of the Mishkan for him is that there be a place for there to be Shekhinah. And that's what Aaron serves. Sorry. Now, I will note that according to our reading and according to our Chilukim, so to speak, he's not really referring to the Aaron. He's referring to the Kaporet here. We noticed, I don't know if we noticed, but I want to show, I don't think we addressed this yet, but let's look at Shemot Kaf He. Kaf He. Right. If we look here, you could note that there's a very clear structure regarding the word V'asu. I would need Tanakh Lab to do that. But you could see it without it. You could see here that V'asu, right? Like you can do Control F here, right? Is the beginning of every. No, it's not working. Okay, it's the beginning of every keli. I'll show you manually, like the old-fashioned days. V'asu Aron aseh shitim, and then you have V'asita kaporet zab tahor, right? And then you have V'asita shulchan, etc. I'm just trying to suggest that structurally speaking, you could see that it's its own keli. So I'm just arguing that Haramban, does not mean to say the primary thing of the Mishkan is the Aron. He really means to say it's the kaporet, but nonetheless. Because the Aron and the Kaporet are higher in Ma'aleh, they are higher in stature, therefore they are first. Now, Vesod HaMishkan אשר יהיה הכבוד אשר שכן על הר סיני, שוכן עליו בנסתר, וכמו שנאמר שם, וישכון כבוד השם על הר סיני, בכתיב, הן לנו השם את כבודו ואת גודלו. כן כתוב במשכן, לכבוד השם עלה את המשכן, והזכיר משכן שני פעמים, לכבוד השם עלה את המשכן, כנגד את כבודו ואת גודלו. Right, he's trying to show all these parallels. He's, you could see difference how, modern people study the Quran. He's saying it says kevodo and godlo, and therefore there needs to be two pesukim of showing where it's in the Mishkan. And then Mishkan Tamid Im Yisrael Hakavod Shenina Lahem Bar Sinai. Again, Haramban's thesis here is Ma Pesher. Right, we'll say it in English. What are we to make of the analogies or the parallels that we can find between Har Sinai and the Mishkan, which are many, and as I'll show, I made a nice chart that will make it clear. He argues that because just as there was the Shekhinah that was Shora on Har Sinai, you have a Mishkan. So basically, it's a journey of the Shekhinah. It started on Sinai, then after Sinai, you have the Mishkan. It goes into the Mishkan so that it could follow Israel in all of its journeys, and that's basically the thesis of Ramban. I want to look with you in this chart. Oh, that's unfortunate that it's like that. I should have made one more enter. Okay, you guys will just have to remember that the Markiv is here, Sinai is here, and Mishkan is here as we go down. Maybe I wonder if it's I think it is worthwhile to. No, it's not. Okay. I want to show you just a few parallels you could see here. So that you have the Shekhinah here, right? So in Sinai it says, "Vayishkon kvod Hashem al har Sinai, vaychaseu ha'anan sheshgamim, vayikra Moshe b'yom ha'shibrei mitoch ha'anan." Shekhinah in Mishkan, v'asal mikdash v'shachati b'tocham. V'lo yachol Moshe. Okay, that's one pasuk. Second pasuk, v'lo yachol Moshe lavo al moed ki shachan alav ha'anan. You see, parallel. Shachen. Clear? Good. Another markiv, anan. Ubrakim ve'anan kaved. Vaychaz ha'anan et ol moed. Another parallel. Now we have Esh. Kevod Hashem ke'esh ochelet. That's on Sinai. V'tese Esh v'fnei Hashem. Right? Okay, good. Another parallel. Hagbalot. You have boundaries. Agbel et ahar v'kidashto. Kol zar lo yikrav. Or I would have chosen the pasuk. I don't know why I didn't. Hazara karev yumat. Right. In any event, right. Tibur Hashem. You have Tibur Hashem from Har Sinai, of course. Elohim with Kol Devarim Ha'ele, and you have in this Mishkan Vayikal Moshe Vaydaber Hashem Elav. Good. Kivod Hashem Shachen al Har Sinai. Kivod Hashem Alei Mishkan. Again. Now, another one that's a little complicated, just to explain. You have two stages in both. You have Moshe Lavo Mahamat Kavod Hashem. Moshe was not able to enter, to go forward, because Kavod Hashem was there, until God called him. So you see also in the Mishkan, in Sinai, in Shemot Kaf Dalet. Velo Yachol Moshe Lavo El Ol Moed Ki Shachan Alav Ha'anan Chod Adonai Malet Mishkan. Only then, later, Vayikra El Moshe Vaydaber Adonai Elav El Moed Lemor. No, sorry, I think I put the pasuk in the wrong place. Sorry. This should be on the other side. Vayal Moshe el Hahar, vaychas ha'anan et Hahar, vayishkon kvod Hashem al Har Sinai, vaychaseu ha'anan sheshtamim, vayikra el Moshe b'yom ha'shivrei mitoch ha'anan. In any event, you could see here that, and this is the Mishkan, that Moshe couldn't come in, and then only in Parashat Vayikra he comes in. Okay, that's the last of the parallels. Now, again, what are we to do with these parallels? So Ramban Nachmani argues that to do the parallels, you see, the fundamental purpose of Sinai was Hashrat Shekhinah, and then the fundamental purpose of the Mishkan was also Hashrat Shekhinah. Shekhinah, and everything else is almost a totza'ah mikach shehashekhinah sharta Hashem. It's only an outcome of the fact that the Shekhinah was Shorah in the Sinai. Then X, Y, and Z happens. Similar with Mishkan, you have the Shekhinah that's Shorah there. The rest is outcomes. Okay, I would like to argue something different. I would like to argue that the fundamental purpose of Sinai and Mishkan is not a place of Shekhinah, rather a place of Mekom Kiritata Berit and Mekom Hemshech Ma'arechet Yahasim Beritiyim. Right? I'll translate it in English. On the one hand, you have Sinai, which is the place of the cutting of the covenant, Kiritata Berit, and the Mishkan basically continues the role of Sinai as the place of Berit. Right? Again, I'll note that the first approach we mentioned last week, we mentioned that perhaps the Mishkan's fundamental purpose was the place to house the Luchot HaBerit and the Aron HaBerit. I want to show some Mekorot that are in line with this approach and develop this idea a little bit further in the time we have. Let's see how long have we been going? We've been going about an hour. Okay, so I'll allot myself another 15 minutes, and Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll finish. Let's see how much we're okay. We do have a bit more to cover. Okay, I'll say very quickly. I won't. I'll say it outside. We'll even stop the sharing. I'll share. I'll have the Habura. I'll share the source sheet with the Habura, and I'll share it with you guys so you can look at the sources later. Right. So I'll look at the source sheet though. sorry. Okay, so to develop this idea of both the Sinai and both the Mishkan being place of Hashat Shekhinah, first of all, I want to address the fact that the misvot, right, of the Berit were given at Sinai, and this function of misvot, they continued in Mishkan, right? The whole sacrificial service, sacrificial rite, I'm sorry, was delivered to Moshe me'ol moed, right? By Moshe v'daber elav me'ol moed demor daber b'nei Yisrael v'natal lehem adam k'ikrim miken. So you can see that at Sinai, the original misvot were first given at Sinai, and then it would continue in the Mishkan. Hakam Fa'ur alav Shalom explained the Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Avot. Right? Moshe kibel Torah miSinai u'mesarah liYoshua. So kibel Torah miSinai, meaning to say, starting from Sinai, not ending at Sinai, not everything was at Sinai, but it started at Sinai. And where to continue? Oil Moed. So you see this relationship of the covenant starting being nichrat on Sinai, and you have Oil Moed, the mitzvot were continued to be brought. Now, one last point before I think we have to go, and then I'll take some questions if anyone has any. I'd like to see anyone who has their camera on, because I haven't really been able to see you guys for this long. Okay. Right. So for anyone who, sorry. So one last question that I'd like to address is the korbanot, right? If what I'm arguing is true, that it's really the place of the Mishkan is mimicking the Sinai as the makom of the Berit. If that's the case, I'd like to address the question of what is the purpose of the korbanot. And with that, I'll share my screen just one more time. Sorry. And I'd like to argue that it's based on, right? That's based on Shemot Kaf Dalet. Right? If you see where it's bolded, Vayashkem Aboker, Vayimizbeach Tachat Ahar, Ushtem Asrem Maseba, Lishnem Asar Shiftei Yisrael. Vayishlach Na'areh Bnei Yisrael, Vayalu Alot, Vayizbehu Zibahim, Shelamim Adonai Parim. Vayikach Moshe Hasi Adam, Vayasba Ganot, Vayhasi Adam Zarak Al Mizbeach, Vayikach Torah Berit, Vayikrab Bizna Ha'am, Vayimru Kol Shet Diber Na'asam V'nishma. Now you can see from this that there was this ceremony where they brought korbanot, right? That's important just to start with. What they did was they brought korbanot, and then they had the ceremony of the Kirat Berit with the Dam Aganot. They put half on Mizbeach and half on Bnei Israel, and they were zorek the dam. I brought here a search of the word zarak in Sefer Vayikra. You could see 12 times. Each time you have the zirikat dam on the Mizbeach. With this in mind, I'd like to argue that the korbanot that we're bringing in the Mishkan are a continuation of the original Kiritat Berit ceremony we find in Kaf Dalet. Just like korbanot were brought in on Sinai, by Sinai and Kiritat Berit, so too the korbanot are being brought in the Mishkan. Further, we could even see this more clearly in Bamidbar Kaf Het. And V'asirita Haifa Asod Min Habib Ula B'Shemen Katit Ribi'i Tahin Orlat Tamid Ha'asuya B'Har Sinai. The Orlat Tamid, which is the korban, the entire, all the korbanot. I think we will discuss this later in the Shorim regarding the korbanot. All of the korbanot are brought in the context of the korban tamid. The korban tamid, the korban, the paradigm of the rest of the korbanot, that is really, its source is Ha'asuya B'Har Sinai. And I think it then makes a lot of sense to understand what I'm trying to get at here, right? That the korbanot, I know it's late, I'm sorry. The korbanot are mimicking, not necessarily mimicking is the right word, but continuing what happened in Sinai. Sinai was Makom Kiritat Berit. The Mishkan is the place of Berit, where the Torah is housed, where the Luchot are housed. I wanted to show you how the Sanhedrin, who really the Torah Shebaal Peh comes out of there, are in Lishkat HaGazit. A lot of other things I wanted to discuss Hakel, but I guess we ran out of time. So I guess we'll pick up next year order from here. But just summarize what we did today. We started this year with a kushiyah from last week about Mizbach HaKetoret and the Kaporet. We discussed really two magamot as they are responding to Chet HaEgel. I argue that the Kaporet is really reinforcing the original purpose of the Mishkan of showing the Luchot HaBerit as the mirkaz of Jewish life as covenantal experience. Then I explained how Mizbach HaKetoret is really a step back from or a counter theme, a complementary counter theme and a smoke screen, Then we discussed tonight really the off of the Mishkan, as I tried to argue tonight, as it is a covenantally symbolic and part of the framework of the covenant. And I guess that's all for tonight. If there was one question in the chat, that I'll read, even though it's my friend Ronnie, who's not here right now. If anyone else who's still made it this far has any questions, I'd be happy to take it. But I'll read this one question in the chat. In 82 and in Shemuel, doesn't seem to be describing the Kerubim as throne, not God's presence in between those Kerubim? I don't really see a difference, right? If you have, maybe yes, maybe not. But even if I don't think so. But even if yes, there's the throne and God sits on the throne. So if, again, I'm imaging it, if this is the two halves of the throne, what's in between that is where God's Shekhinah is. If there's anyone else here that has any questions, I'd be happy to take. If not, Atkan. Any questions? Okay, Hazakum.